Hambantota was never a place the world wanted to discover. It was a place the world learned to bypass. For decades, it remained a dry, forgotten stretch of southern Sri Lanka, where the wind off the Indian Ocean carried salt and dust, rather than money or investment. It was a landscape where fishermen pushed out at dawn in worn-out boats and young people packed their bags for Colombo because the local economy could not offer them a future. This was not globalization's promised land. It was the world's backlot, the periphery of the periphery. As a state, Sri Lanka has always lived in the shadow of its own geography. An island positioned directly on one of the planet's most important commercial arteries, at the crossroads of routes linking the Middle East, Africa, and Southeast Asia, should, in theory, have become the region's logistical heart, and yet for decades it failed to turn that potential into durable advantage. Colonial rule left behind infrastructure designed for exporting raw materials, not for building domestic industrial power. A civil war lasting nearly 3 decades consumed money, energy, and the attention of political elites. The state operated in permanent crisis management mode. Hambantota was the purest symbol of that condition, a region of high unemployment, low urbanization, and thin public investment. A place where development meant a paved road or a new school, not global container terminals. When foreign investors studied maps, Hambantota was a blank spot, not because it was unknown, but because it was not profitable. And yet, it was here that an idea was born. An idea meant to transform not only a region, but the country's future. In the politics of developing states, there is often a moment when infrastructure stops being a tool of development and becomes a tool of ambition. The port at Hambantota was exactly that kind of project. Symbolic, monumental, political. It was meant to prove Sri Lanka was no longer peripheral, but a regional player. It was meant to shift the economic center of gravity from Colombo to the south. It was meant to manufacture a new engine of growth. The problem was that global trade does not run on the ambitions of local politicians. It runs on the logic of cost, time, and scale. Ships do not reroute because a new port appears on the coastline. They reroute when new infrastructure delivers a concrete logistical advantage. Hambantota did not have that advantage. The Indian Ocean is one of the most congested commercial seas on Earth. Every day, thousands of vessels cut through it, moving oil, gas, containers, raw materials, and industrial goods. But most of those ships do not need new stops. They need proven hubs: Colombo, Singapore, Dubai, Salalah, places where transshipment is concentrated, where supporting industries exist, where logistics networks have matured. Hambantota was close to the routes, but not on them. That difference is invisible on political maps, but perfectly clear to logistics operators. A few dozen nautical miles off course translates into extra hours, extra fuel, extra port fees, and higher delay risk. In an industry where margins can be measured in cents per container, that is reason enough to sail past a new port. And yet, the project went ahead. Because Hambantota was never a purely economic decision, it was a political decision. The region formed part of the ruling power base. It carried symbolic weight in the local identity of governing elites. The port was meant to be tangible proof of modernization, a concrete monument to success, and that is precisely where the story begins to resemble what the world now recognizes as a textbook case of an infrastructure trap. Sri Lanka did not have the capital to finance the project on its own. Building a modern deep-water port is not a tens of millions investment. It is hundreds of millions, sometimes billions. Cranes, berths, breakwaters, dredging, traffic management systems, energy infrastructure, an entire technical apparatus. Western financial institutions examined the plan and responded coldly. The risk was too high. Traffic projections were too optimistic. The business model was too weak. Banks and development agencies were unwilling to fund a port without solid economic foundations. For Sri Lanka, the implication was blunt. The project that was supposed to symbolize modernity stalled at the level of aspiration. And then another player arrived, China. For Beijing, Hambantota was not merely a port. It was a node within a wider strategy, a checkpoint on the Indian Ocean, part of a logistics architecture linking Asia with Africa and Europe. The objective was not immediate profit. It was infrastructural positioning. That difference matters. The West evaluated Hambantota through the lens of profitability. China evaluated it through the lens of long-term influence. The offer was fast, concrete, and bundled. State-backed loans executed by Chinese construction firms using Chinese equipment and technology. For Sri Lanka, it was the only viable way to turn the project from paper into steel and concrete. At the moment the first agreements were signed, no one spoke publicly about losing control. The language was partnership, development, modernization, the region's future. Construction began. Heavy machinery rolled onto the coastline. Breakwaters cut into the sea. Gantry cranes rose like steel trees. For local communities, it looked like the dawn of a new era. Jobs, investment, movement, hope. But alongside the concrete and steel, another structure began to grow, one invisible to cameras. A financial structure. Infrastructure loans are not like ordinary consumer debt. They are tied to contractors, timelines, management systems, and long-term service agreements. The money does not circulate freely through the local economy. A large portion flows back to the creditor country through contracts. Sri Lanka formally received a port. In practice, it also received debt. And the debt began to take on a life of its own. Once the port came online, traffic turned out to be far lower than forecast. The terminal sat underused. Cranes stood idle. Revenues did not cover operating costs, let alone debt service. The state began subsidizing the project from the national budget. Funds that should have gone to education, healthcare, and social infrastructure were diverted to keep the port afloat. Hambantota, once marketed as a development symbol, slowly became a burden. But the mechanism was already in motion. The port existed, the loans were signed, the contracts were binding, and the global infrastructure game was only accelerating. Sri Lanka found itself in a position many developing states would later learn all too well. Caught between ambition and reality, between a development promise and the brutal arithmetic of balance sheets, Hambantota became a test, not only for Sri Lanka, but for the world. A test of what happens when a state builds infrastructure it cannot sustain. When geopolitics collides with accounting, when one side's long-term strategy meets the other side's short-term survival needs. And it is here that the next chapter begins. The chapter in which debt stops being a financial problem and becomes an instrument of power. China's proposal did not arrive in Hambantota like a storm. It came quietly, through delegations, documents, memoranda, presentations filled with sleek visualizations of modern terminals, futuristic cranes, and ships gliding across a calm ocean. There were no ultimatums, no military pressure, only the narrative of development. For Sri Lanka, it sounded like an answer to everything missing for decades: capital, technology, speed, and, crucially, no political conditions. No lectures on governance reform, no media pressure, only simplicity. We build, you repay, everyone wins. That simplicity would prove the most dangerous part. China's infrastructure financing model differed fundamentally from Western development institutions. The World Bank, the IMF, and regional lenders demanded audits, environmental assessments, fiscal reforms, procurement transparency. The process was slow, complex, politically expensive. Beijing offered a package: credit, contractor, technology, equipment, personnel, everything in one move. Fast, efficient, bureaucratically elegant. For Sri Lanka's government, it was an offer too tempting to refuse. The loan agreements were signed largely with Chinese state banks. On paper, repayment terms looked manageable. Interest rates were not extreme. The schedule seemed feasible. But the real story was in the structure. The money was formally dispersed to Sri Lanka. In practice, much of it flowed straight back to China. Chinese construction firms executed the contracts. Chinese equipment was deployed on site. Chinese engineers supervised the project. Chinese management systems were installed inside the port's operational core. A closed financial circuit emerged. Sri Lanka was left with a physical asset and a financial obligation, without full control over the know-how or the port's operational spine. At that point, Hambantota stopped being just an infrastructure project. It became an architecture of dependence. China's strategy was not to seize control immediately. It was to build negotiating leverage over time, patiently, structurally. The port did not need to be profitable right away. It only needed to generate obligations. As the port underperformed, debt service became heavier. Sri Lanka's broader economy came under pressure. Weaker tourism revenues, export troubles, rising energy import costs, currency depreciation, inflation. Each year made repayment harder, and then the true function of the debt architecture revealed itself. There was no threatening phone call, no public demands, only technical meetings, working-level negotiations, offers of restructuring, and one pivotal suggestion: convert debt pressure into operational control. That was the turning point. From an accounting perspective, it looked rational. The state could not service the obligations. The port was not generating revenue. The solution was a long-term lease. A Chinese operator promised modernization investment, promised efficiency, promised traffic. From a geopolitical perspective, it was the moment infrastructure ceased to be national in any meaningful operational sense. Negotiations dragged on behind closed doors. Documents were technical, dense with legal clauses most citizens could not interpret. Public messaging spoke of strategic partnership, a new stage of cooperation. But the core issue was simple: control. When the nearly century-long lease was signed, Hambantota still appeared on Sri Lanka's map. The flag still flew. Parliament still sat. The state remained sovereign in legal form. But the port was no longer sovereign operationally. The Chinese operator took over terminal management, vessel scheduling, cargo prioritization, IT systems, trade data, investment decisions. Infrastructure changed hands not through war, but through the logic of debt and contracts. Hambantota became a precedent. The world saw, in unusually clear form, a new model of infrastructural expansion. Not colonies, not formal military bases, not territorial administration, but debt, contracts, operational control. It worked because it was elegant. No images of violence, no global outrage, no mass mobilization, and yet it was effective. For Beijing, Hambantota became a strategic point on the Indian Ocean map, a place to shape logistics, monitor maritime movement, build infrastructural presence in a region long dominated by India and the West. For Sri Lanka, it became a symbol of lost control. Public questions came late. Why such a long lease? Why no transparent debate? Why no alternative? But by then, the mechanism was already running. Hambantota stopped being a local development project. It became a piece of a global puzzle. Leverage, bargaining power, the signature of a new era of infrastructure geopolitics. And that is when the world began to look at Sri Lanka not as an island in the Indian Ocean, but as a warning. Because if a port can be effectively taken through debt, what else can be taken? Railways, power plants, energy grids, transport corridors, data centers. Hambantota showed that 21st century empires do not need armies at borders. Contracts are enough. On paper, Hambantota looked impressive. Long berths, modern cranes, a deep channel capable of receiving the world's largest ships, an infrastructure package as advanced as ports in Europe or the Gulf. From above, it resembled modernization triumph. From the state budget's perspective, it was a weight growing heavier by the month. The port existed physically. Economically, it was hollow. Ships called sporadically. Shipping lines treated Hambantota as an experiment, not a primary transshipment hub. The region lacked an industrial hinterland, no natural cargo stream. Inland logistics were underdeveloped, meaning even the few shipments that did arrive often generated more friction than profit. Meanwhile, costs rose relentlessly. Running a port is not just salaries and electricity. It is crane maintenance, breakwater upkeep, dredging, security systems, insurance, administration. This is infrastructure that cannot be paused. It must operate continuously, even when it generates little or no revenue. Sri Lanka began to subsidize Hambantota from the central budget. Money meant for schools, hospitals, and social programs was redirected toward a port that was supposed to deliver prosperity but was becoming a financial sinkhole. At the same time, the country's macroeconomic pressures intensified, widening trade deficits, shrinking foreign reserves, refinancing old debt with new borrowing, a tightening debt spiral, and at that moment, Hambantota stopped being merely an infrastructure story. It became a political crisis. Public frustration grew. People saw rising food prices, fuel shortages, inflation, unemployment, and at the same time, a gleaming port that looked empty. An ambition monument that failed to translate into everyday well-being. The government was trapped. It could not shut the port down. It could not keep funding the losses. Every option carried political costs. And then the Chinese offer returned, this time not as construction financing, but as rescue. Presented as pragmatism, the Chinese operator would take over management, inject capital, improve efficiency, attract traffic. In return, Sri Lanka would surrender operational control and ownership stakes under a long-term lease. The framing was polished: cooperation, partnership, stabilization, a new beginning. But beneath it was arithmetic with no mercy. Hambantota's debt burden was too large to be serviced by operating income. Every month of delay made the national balance sheet worse. The government feared the port could trigger a broader financial meltdown. So the port ceased to be an asset. It became a bargaining chip. Negotiations were no longer about Hambantota alone. They were about sovereign creditworthiness, relationships with global creditors, currency stability, default risk. In that environment, giving up control began to look like the lesser evil. A deal was signed, a near-century lease. Operational control transferred to a Chinese consortium. For the public, it was shock. For financial markets, it signaled a debt trap. For Beijing, it demonstrated the power of infrastructure strategy. Hambantota became the most famous example of what many later called debt diplomacy, a model where infrastructure financing can translate into political leverage without military force. But the crisis did not end there. Handing over the port did not fix Sri Lanka's structural vulnerabilities. Debt remained high. The economy stayed exposed to external shocks. Tourism revenue fluctuated. Energy imports tied national stability to global oil prices. Hambantota was simply the most visible symbol of a deeper issue: development built on large-scale infrastructure credit without a matching production and export base. Systemic consequences followed: declining investor confidence, currency pressure, higher borrowing costs, rising default risk. And at that point, Hambantota stopped being Sri Lanka's local story. It became a global warning signal. Governments across Africa, Central Asia, and Latin America began re-evaluating their own Chinese-financed infrastructure projects. Economists flagged structural risks. Western media reached for terms like new colonialism and infrastructure empire. But the global mechanism was already in motion. Hambantota proved infrastructure could be a lever as powerful as sanctions or military deployments. That a port could function as economic power. That concrete and steel could shift the balance of power faster than diplomacy. And the Indian Ocean, long treated as a neutral trade highway, started to look like a chessboard, on which Hambantota was one of the first pawns. 99 years sounds abstract. It exceeds the lifespan of most people. It spans generations, far beyond election cycles, government terms, even political eras. The Hambantota lease was not a routine commercial contract. It was a document that rewired a region's future. Official statements spoke of strategic partnership and financial stabilization. The language was technical, neutral, emotionless. For many Sri Lankans, it felt like a verdict. A port built as a symbol of national pride handed over for longer than the country's modern independence. Protests erupted. Port unions warned of job losses and local marginalization. The opposition spoke of national betrayal. Society split between fear of bankruptcy and fear of losing control. But the decision was effectively irreversible. The Chinese operator moved in, procedures changed, IT systems changed, employment structures shifted. The port began running on logistics standards set by its new operational master. From the outside, it looked like professionalization, efficiency, modernization. From a state perspective, it meant something deeper, loss of control over a critical infrastructure node. Because a port is not just concrete, it is data, schedules, vessel movement intelligence, visibility into regional trade, the ability to prioritize cargo, influence over who uses the infrastructure and under what conditions. Hambantota therefore became not only an economic asset, but a geopolitical instrument. The regional reaction was immediate. India, long treating the Indian Ocean as its natural sphere, saw Hambantota as a potential Chinese foothold. The distance to India's coastline was uncomfortably small. For defense analysts, that meant a new observation point in the neighborhood. Officially, the port remained civilian, but history teaches that dual-use infrastructure rarely begins as a military base. It begins as logistics, servicing, resupply. Hambantota fit neatly into what some strategists called the string of pearls, a chain of ports and logistics points stretching from the South China Sea across the Indian Ocean to East Africa. Each node alone looked harmless. Together, they mapped power projection. The United States also watched more closely. For Washington, the Indian Ocean is central to global trade and energy security. Control of these waters shapes oil transit from the Middle East and routes linking Europe and Asia. Hambantota suddenly sat under the gaze of the world's biggest players. Sri Lanka, seeking development, had been pulled into great power rivalry. The port became part of a game whose scale local elites likely underestimated. The deepest irony was that the port still did not handle massive trade volumes. Its significance came not from how many containers moved through it, but from where it sat and what it could become. That reveals a key shift. In the 20th century, power followed production and volume. In the 21st, power follows position and control over nodes. Hambantota was an investment not in the present, but in the future. For Beijing, it was a long-term bet on infrastructural dominance. For India and the US, it was a warning. For Sri Lanka, it was the moment autonomy began to narrow in one of the country's most important interfaces with the world. And here, the paradox becomes complete. The port was meant to strengthen economic sovereignty. It became the symbol of its constraint. Sri Lanka kept the flag, the constitution, the formal ownership of land. But it lost real influence over what happened at its most strategic gateway. Hambantota showed that modern loss of sovereignty can arrive without dramatic images. No soldiers, no tanks, only contracts, regulations, logistics dashboards, a silent transfer of power. And that is precisely why it is so dangerous. Societies often realize too late, when infrastructure already runs on someone else's systems, when financial dependence is too deep to break, when the cost of regaining control exceeds the cost of losing it. Hambantota became more than a port. It became a warning for Europe, for Africa, for Central Asia, for any country building its development on infrastructure credit without strategic safeguards. But this story is not finished. Hambantota is only one point on the map. The real contest stretches across the entire Indian Ocean, and that is where the next episode begins.